All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the first of what will hopefully be many videos in our AOS2 economics video series to help with your remote learning. And at the moment, just to recap everything we've done so far, so you'll be fresh, you'll know everything, you'll feel really confident before we start moving into some more difficult or newer things over the coming weeks. Hope you've had a good break, but let's get into what we're going to look at today. So today we're going to summarize the preconditions of a perfectly competitive market. We're going to look at the different types of market power and market structures that exist briefly, and then we're going to look at relative prices and how they affect decision making for both businesses and consumers. Hopefully this will just take about 10 to 15 minutes. Then in future videos later this week that I'm going to record, we're going to look at the law of demand, the law of supply, equilibriums, as well as a brief summary of the cryptocurrency market and what you'll be asked about that in a SAC type condition, which will come up in a couple of weeks. So first up, we're going to look at the assumptions of a perfectly competitive market. A perfectly competitive market is where it's the most competition that exists in a single market. So it is a market where there is no product differentiation, which is also sometimes called when there are homogeneous products. This is where there is no brand differentiation. Basically, no matter who is selling that good or service, it is exactly the same no matter who you go to. This is when we use the example of things like if you go to the Queen Vic market, which is a terrible example at the moment because we are all confined to our homes other than when we go out for grocery shopping or for exercise. But if you were to go to the Queen Victoria market and you wanted to buy an apple, there are probably 10 or 20 people who are selling the same exact variety of apples that look the same, they probably taste the same, and there is no differentiation between them. So how is that going to affect your decision making as a consumer? Well, you're probably just going to buy whichever one is the cheapest. And because there is no product differentiation, there is an incredibly high level of competition, and we call that being perfectly competitive. And it also lines up with the point here that there are many buyers and sellers in that market. So if you were to go to the Queen Vic market, there are a lot of buyers and sellers directly competing with each other. And that means that sellers have to make sure their prices are as low as possible to maximize their overall sales. And because of this, and because there are so many sellers there, they are what we call price takers. This means they just have to accept whichever price is being offered to them by consumers, because if they do not, the consumer is just going to move on to the next stall where it might be cheaper and will buy from them, and the original business will lose their sale and will no longer be competitive. Another thing about perfectly competitive markets is that there is ease of entry and exit. What that means is there's limited barriers to entry. It's not too difficult to enter that market and begin selling in that market. So we often use agricultural goods and services in these examples because basically if you wanted to sell apples, to keep using apples as an example, if you have soil in your backyard, you can technically plant apple trees and grow apples and then sell them. There's very little barrier to entry there. As long as you have the seeds to grow an apple tree, you are fine, you can enter that market, and therefore you can compete in that market. There will be other elements that affect how competitive you can be, but there is very little barrier preventing you from entering that market or exiting if you find you're not competitive. So in perfectly competitive markets, businesses will produce the goods and services which are being demanded by consumers at the lowest possible price to maximize their sales. This is a situation known as consumer sovereignty. This phrasing comes up a fair bit. It's not really specifically in the study design, but it often gets asked about or just comes up in questions. Consumer sovereignty is basically the situation where businesses have to produce what consumers want at a low price or else it will not be purchased. And therefore, consumer sovereignty is basically saying it's a situation where the consumers are in the best position overall. In perfectly competitive markets, it's also assumed that resources are mobile. What that means is if a business finds what they're producing is no longer profitable, they can quickly allocate their resources to a different good or service if there is demand for them to do so. So if they were growing apples and apples are suddenly no longer in demand, they can suddenly get rid of all their apple trees and start maybe growing lemons because lemons are really popular and everyone wants more zest in their life. Therefore, they reallocate those resources. They are mobile, they can reallocate them into growing lemon trees, and then suddenly they can compete in that market. So that is the assumptions of a perfectly competitive market. It is these 4 assumptions here. You definitely need to know them. So I'd recommend knowing them pretty well, as I highlight it with a dodgy choice of red, which doesn't really show up very well over the slide. So from perfectly competitive market, we jump to the different levels of market power that exist in different market structures. So if you look at the lower end where there is the most competition, and I'll write that in here, that's what we just talked about. So there is the most competition when we have pure or perfect competition, and that is exactly what we just talked about. So that is when there are many sellers, there's strong competition, there is no product differentiation or homogeneous products, ease of entry and exit, firms are price takers, and have little market power. So that's what we just talked about with perfect competition. It's exactly the same. It's where there is the most competition and the businesses have the least market power. Then as we slowly move up, we get into what's called monopolistic competition, which is almost exactly the same, except there is what's called some product differentiation, which mainly comes through branding. So we always use the example here of like Coke and Pepsi, or like Cadbury and Lindt. When there is some product differentiation, people will have some loyalty to specific products, and therefore that creates some price variation. So Coke charges a higher price all the time because they see themselves as a premium product. People are loyal to that product, and therefore they can sell it at a higher price because they have a little bit more market power. So if you ever get asked about monopolistic competition, you should always use those kind of examples of how branding affects people's decision making and how that can affect the pricing, because that makes it really clear that you know what you're talking about. Then when we look at oligopoly, where there is less competition again, this is where there's only a few sellers. The main example we ever use for this is the supermarkets, where we look at Coles, Woolworths, Aldi, potentially IGA and Foodworks in there as well. There's not that many options if you want to buy groceries in Australia, and therefore that gives those businesses a lot more market power to charge the prices that they want. There's some product differentiation between the different supermarkets. You'll see that they try and have exclusive products that the others don't have, and that tries to lure business in. Sometimes they'll get exclusives of certain products, and that's trying to separate themselves from the others so they can make sure people are coming and shopping with them. There's fairly difficult entry and exit into an oligopoly. If you want to start a supermarket, good luck to you, because they are going to try and price you out of the market because they have so much power. They can sell products at a price that is cheaper than you could. And say, for example, how they sell milk for $2. If you try to start a supermarket and sell milk for $2, you'd be losing money on every bottle. But they have the power to do that and still be profitable. And therefore it's very difficult to enter the market and compete against them because you just do not have the power that they have in that market. And then lastly, we've got pure monopolies, where there is only one seller. There's not too many examples of monopolies these days. The ACCC does a really good job at making sure monopolies don't really exist too much in Australia, and that's mainly because when there is a monopoly, they have way too much market power and they can charge whatever price they want, and they don't really have to worry about quality or anything like that because they're the only seller. If you want that product, you will buy it. Even though they're not technically a monopoly, Apple's an example that we most often use for monopoly because people kind of treat their products like they would if they were a monopoly. So with Apple products, people are loyal to those products and they will pay whatever price they have to for them. And if they need to replace one, they're going to pay a high price for it again. And so product differentiation tends to be relatively unimportant. For example, Apple products, people will buy it because it's an Apple product. It doesn't need to be that different from anything else because it's the only ones available. Entry and exit's really, really difficult. You would not try and start business in the smartphone industry these days because Samsung and Apple really dominate the market and you wouldn't really be competing against them. And the key thing with this is that they are a price maker, which means they have a lot of market power and they can charge whatever price they want. I don't know how much an iPhone goes for these days, but I'm pretty sure the new ones are up to $2,000, which seems really insane for a phone that you're probably just going to drop and have to pay to replace the screen 1,000 different times. Lastly, that we're going to talk about is relative prices. So when we talk about relative prices, we talk about them from the point of view of businesses mainly, but sometimes we also come up from the point of view of consumption as well. To look at business first, relative prices are the selling price of one good or service compared to another. So for businesses, relative prices help them to decide where to allocate their productive resources to maximize their profits. So businesses are likely to produce the goods or services which are the most relatively profitable. And what that means is they're going to want to produce the goods or services which are going to sell for the highest price, because then they are going to get more profit in return. So to go away from my usual apples and oranges example for this, because I was getting tired of it, based on the current pandemic, the sales of fitness equipment has gone insane. So if you were a business that produces fitness equipment and you had the option to produce kettlebells or dumbbells for the same price, and there was an increase in the selling price of kettlebells due to increased demand, which is happening right now, you would reallocate your resources into production of kettlebells, because they are going to get you a lot more profit at the moment, because they're going to be more relatively profitable because the selling price is increased. And so relative prices are all about businesses reallocating their productive resources into what's going to be the most relatively profitable. For consumption, on the other hand, it's a lot simpler. So with consumption, consumers are just going to buy whatever is relatively cheaper. If you look at two products that are relatively the same, and one's cheaper than the other, and they're the same quality, you're going to buy the cheaper one. And that's all of how it works with consumers. All right, that's all for today. Relatively short, we're hitting about 12 minutes at the moment. I'll hopefully be back tomorrow or the next day, sometime soon, with a video about the law of demand, about changes in price and what causes shifts in demand. Other than that, I hope you have a good day and that this was useful for you. Have a good day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.